All right, black crime. Let's get into this. So you have two sides. On one side, you have chronic stress, unstable families, poor housing, exposure to lead, mercury, and other environmental pollutants, weaker institutions, exposure to violence at a young age, limited legitimate opportunities, and environments where criminal networks have more influence, we'll just say. However, poverty alone obviously does not make an individual criminal. Biology matters too, but genes are inherited and genes are also influenced. So if you're looking at IQ, nutrition, environmental conditions, the upbringing, it can affect brain development and behavior, and it can interact with genetic predispositions possibly. So it's nature and nurture. For example, if I look at like a Hadzabe, like a person from the Hadza tribe, he's going to be extremely friendly, peaceful, and communal, and he's going to treat outsiders like family. But if you had to go to like, a YN that had the Afro-American experience, you're going to get two completely different results. And, the second aspect is that I grew up in the hood. I still live there, but I've been able to overcome my circumstances. And now I focus on personal growth, responsibility, development. But just because I have this mindset doesn't mean that, I didn't have to overcome so many other obstacles that other people are trying to overcome. I think there are two sides of the spectrum. One, I think it's evil and cruel to ignore environmental factors and just blame the individual who was born into them. But two, I also think it's immature, lazy, and pernicious to acknowledge a negative culture around you. And as a collective, you don't try to change the behavior. And this is where the brain becomes important, right? There's not like a single like murder section of the brain or anything like that, but I can go into specifics. So you have like the prefrontal cortex, which helps with impulse control, planning, decision making, and evaluating consequences. You have the amygdala, which helps process threats and strong emotions. You have the anterior cingulate, which helps regulate conflict and behavior and reward systems, influencing whether somebody prioritizes an immediate payoff or, a future consequence. And when children are growing up constantly learning, watch your back, don't trust the police, don't trust that dude over there, don't look weak, don't cry, hit them if they hit you back. Chronic stress and trauma can shape how these systems in your brain are developing. And it doesn't excuse violence, but it does explain one mechanism by which environments can increase risk. So there's one gene, the MAOA gene. It's also known as the warrior gene. It affects the breakdown of certain neurotransmitters, and research has found interactions between lower activity variants and childhood maltreatment and predicting antisocial behavior. There's also been research on the rarer 2R variant, but none of this necessarily means somebody inherits an allele and is like destined to become violent. In all of my studies, I've concluded that antisocial behavior is complex and polygenic. There's no like scientifically established like black crime gene. Like I said, the environment and the toxins matter too. Like lead is neurotoxic. In childhood, lead exposure has been associated with later problems like attention, cognition, behavioral regulation, increased risks of arrests, violent offending. You have mercury, which is also neurotoxic, and it can affect attention, cognitive development. Although the evidence connecting mercury specifically to violence is much weaker than the evidence around lead, but you stack that with air pollution, deteriorating housing, noise, food insecurity, poor schools, neighborhood violence, and chronic stress. And people can bring up like food stamps, but they're not really buying like healthy options either. But let's talk about the racial disparity in violence, because I know a lot of people are going to want to talk about that one. So in 2023, there was victimization data, and Black Americans were disproportionately identified as offenders in violent incidences, but males and young adults were dramatically overrepresented. Which is why, saying black people commit crime, it tells you nothing about like causation, sex, age, neighborhood, poverty, social networks, trauma, and opportunity or limited opportunity. And Black Americans are not only like disproportionately represented among some offenders, they are disproportionately represented among homicide victims in particular. So when somebody says like, black on black crime, you have to understand what they're talking about, right? So we're talking about dead black children, fathers, mothers, and traumatized communities. And it's very unfortunate. And obviously there's a cultural attitude that reinforces that. The hip hop culture, the be tough culture. And crime is also heavily shaped by proximity. Like you could be a person that was destined to be good and you're just growing up around people that are continuing this negative cycle. And it's unfortunate. And, that doesn't mean that it's only one thing. And I would say, in regards to the genetic aspect, one of the strongest arguments against like the racial genetic fatalism is that crime rates do change enormously within the same population over a relatively short period. Black male homicide offending rates rose dramatically during the late 20th century and then fell dramatically afterward. Their ancestry didn't change, drug markets changed, policing changed, incarceration changed, neighborhoods changed, opportunities changed, demographics changed, violence, culture. It's everything. It's the systemic factors, the environmental factors, as well as the individual. But, America as a whole experienced enormous swings in homicide in general, right? A gene pool doesn't transform in 10 or 15 years, so genes can't be the whole explanation. That's not how genetics work. Now, if we're talking about structure, let's just say family structure, around 1960, roughly 2/3 of black children lived with two parents, and obviously that number declined substantially. Fathers, mothers, supervision, stability, discipline, role models, household cooperation, all of that is important with raising a child. But, you can't reduce the entire history of black violence to, fathers went away, right? Crime was already a serious problem before the family decline reached its later levels, if we're just being completely honest. So what happened, right? Well, there wasn't a single year where everything went bad. There were broad cultural changes across America. You had the marriage patterns that were changing, sexual norms were changing. But black communities were also dealing with specific structural pressures. I know a lot of people don't like to go back this far, but if you go back to slavery, where families could literally be separated through sale, if you're looking at the emancipation, after that, you had black codes, racial terrorism, segregation, Jim Crow, and then the 20th century, housing discrimination, redlining. Black families were restricted, and home ownership, it was hard to come across. And there are people alive today that grew up in the civil rights era, and you have to think about their kids and their grandkids. A lot of people say this stuff happened so long ago, but if you have a parent or a grandparent that was alive during this time period, that's going to directly impact how you grew up, right? So, I think it's a myriad of reasons. I think if you're looking at drugs, that was also a big problem. It destabilized families. Incarceration went through the roof. The American prison population grew dramatically from 1980 to into the 1990s, and black men were disproportionately incarcerated. And some of that reflected real differences in offending, but some also reflected sentencing and enforcement policy. But whatever combination you believe mattered most, removing large numbers of men from communities becomes, part of the environment that the next generation grows up in. The FBI, concluded that individuals or children growing up without a father, they're significantly more likely to engage in criminal behavior regardless of the race. And, when you're looking at unstable families, and a generation of that happening, and nobody around but like the big homie leading them in the wrong direction, now you have like a feedback loop. And this is where culture enters the conversation, because culture and environment, they're not opposites. Culture develops inside of environments. So if calling the police makes you a snitch, then violence is something that's like more self-policing. Like you're more likely to handle the situation how you see fit. If walking away makes you weak, then retaliation, it gains you status. If the drug dealer has the money and, you know, if the drug dealer has money and let's just say he got that money from committing crime, and people are going to imitate it because it's a rewarding behavior. And I think the Hadza example, not to pivot, I think it's useful here because, you know, I don't want people to romanticize people who never have conflict. I think you should be a man where it's necessary. But the larger point is that even among genetically similar people, sorry, I keep getting texts. One sec. This is like really annoying. It's like throwing me off. I'm going to put my phone on Do Not Disturb. Okay, we're good. What was I saying? Something genius. No, I'm just kidding. But what I was saying is that they're genetically similar, but they adapt to different ecosystems. People say, oh, it's the black genes. Well, where does the gene come from? You know, there are different types of black people. Obviously, some of them are not the way you're describing. The Hadza people, if you brought them to America, they would be completely different. Environment shapes your genes, period. You know what I mean? The only reason why we have different races is because of environment. That's the only reason why. If everybody stayed in the motherland, wherever you think the motherland is, everybody would just look more or less kind of the same if you lived in one specific part of the motherland, right? So it's all environment. Every metric that you can point to, it's directly linked to environment. But you know, I think a lot of people just have this cognitive dissonance and they can't accept that multiple things can be true at once. One side says, oh, all the crime is because of racism and because of history and because, you know, of this and that. And then the other side is just like, oh, no, it's just your genetics. Like, you know, I looked at this one region where this other demographic makes less money than you, but they commit less crime than you. And I think both sides are dishonest, but I think both sides are trying to bring about a positive change. One side, maybe it's through accountability, and one side is through acknowledging pressures on the people that can make it hard for progression. So I do want people to progress, and you know, of course you can know what happened to you, you can study history, study Jim Crow, study all of that. You can be aware of housing discrimination, sentencing disparities, you can be aware of environmental racism, mass incarceration, you know, and don't let people gaslight you into thinking it never mattered. But to acknowledge that something mattered doesn't mean that it has to affect you moving forward. And it's going to be tough. It's going to be a struggle, obviously, to overcome that. But I would just probably say the best thing you can do is to act like, you know, reparations are never going to happen. No one is coming to save you. And the only thing that can define your progression is your personal development and your own strength. I think that's the best way to structure your life. To accept what you cannot control. If you want to fight for what you think is owed to you, by all means fight. But at the end of the day, you have to have something to fall back on. And that's something that you need to that's something that you need to have is it's going to have to be strength. So it's not a mentality of acting like Jim Crow didn't exist. And it's also not, you know, acting like it has to mean everything. So you have to transcend and you have to train yourself towards finding and looking for peace, love, positivity, unity, emotional control, personal responsibility. The whole world isn't going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, I know that. But you can still affect what you can control. What you can control is your echo chamber, your groups of people that you keep around you, your circle essentially. So I think your past can explain who you are without that becoming your destiny. You know what I mean? It can say why you've gotten to this point, but you have to decide what your future is going to look like. So yeah, I think it's a mixture of all of those things. And I could relitigate historical grievances, and I could talk about genetics, and I could talk about all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, everybody has to work together. So it starts with your own block, your own neighborhood. You know, stop treating intelligence like acting white. Stop treating a well-spoken person like a coon. Stop telling boys that emotional restraint is weakness. Stop producing children that you don't want to raise. You know, fathers be fathers, mothers be mothers. Work together. You know, celebrate the kid who stays in school. Celebrate the person who starts their own business. You know, celebrate the man who's stoic and controls his anger. Like in that video I posted where that lady was screaming at me and I was keeping my composure. A couple of people were saying that I was PUSSY for that. That has to go. You know what I mean? Because what would the superior option have been? I just, no, obviously not. So it starts within the house. That's the most important thing. You have to foster change at home. And if you're bright enough to absorb everything I'm saying, then I think you're going to be bright enough to facilitate a positive change. That's what I think. And I'm not trying to say this to be disrespectful, but it could be much worse. You know, with Native Americans, most people can't even name 2 or 3 Native Americans because of what happened with them. You know, but black people, there are a lot of inspirational black people that you could look at that are inspiring. But with Native Americans, I mean, look at what happened to them. Look at the catastrophic injustice. They not only had to endure discrimination and slavery, but their population was reduced to like 10%. You know, so the fact that you can't even name 3 Native Americans, maybe some of you guys can't even name 1. And then if you do name that 1 Native American, they're probably not even going to be like fully Native or close to Native. You know, it's unfortunate. But I'll land the plane with this. There's not one answer for black crime. It's biology, brain development, genes interacting with environments, lead, trauma, chronic stress, family structure, peer influence, guns, illicit markets, poverty, historical policy, discrimination, incarceration, cultural norms, your personality, your opportunities or lack of. And the final thing is choice. Choice. So every single day you make a choice, and we're all lucky to be here, you know, numerically with how many sperm there are, all the things that can go wrong when you're in the womb, all the times that you went out to the store and you could have gotten hit by a car, God forbid. But there are so many things that could have happened that could have prevented this very conversation. And we're all here. I don't know why my voice is getting low, but this is what happens if I talk for a while. We're all here today, and we all have to acknowledge that, and we all have to, lock in and try to do better as people, not just black people, but as human beings.